Hey everybody, welcome back to the second episode of Horror Trans Podcast. This is my new podcast, and today I'm going to be doing something different. Obviously, I'm on video. Yay! Hopefully you're watching this on YouTube, but if you're getting it on your podcast app, that's fine too. So I'm still playing around with the format of the show. And I've decided Mondays are going to be my regular podcast day. So you'll get new episodes on Mondays. So I apologize for doing another one so soon. Or you're welcome for me doing another one so soon. Depending on how you look at it. The one I did on Saturday was a test. Just to set up the podcast and get my thoughts out there on a couple things. So, one of the reasons I wanted to do a podcast was because my channel, Horror Trans, I talk about all things horror. But it's really hard to talk about, like, video games and TV shows, books, and other things in the context of rent or buy, obviously. Short reviews and horror icons. So, the podcast is a chance for me to, get into a little deeper topics than just movie reviews. Which doesn't mean I won't review movies on the podcast, or revisit movies I've already reviewed on the show. Maybe take a deeper dive or a second look, perhaps, for some of them. But for the most part, it's just going to be topics, And today I got some good topics. So, I don't really want to do like horror news and rumors and stuff. But there is a movie out that I want to talk about real quick that I did start to watch on, I believe it was Amazon Prime or Max, I can't remember. And it's called It's a Wonderful Knife. Now, I have talked about previously in my reviews on Horror Trans how much I despise horror comedy. I'm not a fan of comedy in general. So there is that. So when I was watching It's a Wonderful Knife, I went into it with the expectation that it was going to be a slasher movie. Because that's what I was told that it was, more or less. And it kind of is. But I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to review this for the channel because I couldn't finish it. It's too stupid. So, if you're watching this and you're waiting for me to do a review of It's a Wonderful Knife, I'm not going to do it. The movie was too stupid, I couldn't finish it. I had to turn it off. I cannot do stupid horror. I can handle B-movies if it's like, cheesy, but like, entertaining. But if you're making it stupid on purpose, like a B-movie to me, and I'll talk about this when I do B-movie topics, but to me a B-movie is somebody who has no experience making a film. Who's just sets out to make a film and, they do their best. But, they fall short because they got friends doing the acting and inexperienced non-union workers doing the crew, and it's just, low budget and no experience. Sometimes it works out and you get a fun movie. And sometimes you end up with Troll 2. Yes, I know, someday I'm going to have to sit down and watch the Troll movies back to back so I can review them, even though I know that they're stupid. But I feel like I'm willing to do that. And I was willing to watch It's a Wonderful Knife. But it rubbed me the wrong way. First of all, Joel McHale does not belong in a horror movie. As soon as I see him in the crowd shot, I'm like, oh God, I know what kind of movie this is. Not a horror movie I can take seriously. It's like Simon fucking Pegg. If I hear that there's a, quote, horror movie that has Simon Pegg in it, I ain't fucking watching it. So if you're sitting around waiting for me to do Shaun of the Dead, it ain't happening. I will never subject my eyes to that fucking rubbish again. That's my review of it. The movie's rubbish, and I will never subject myself to it again. You're not getting a full review of that movie. It sucks. I hate it. I am not a fan of spoofs. I am not a fan of comedy. And I really hate horror comedy. And the reason why I hate horror comedy is because it isn't just making fun of the horror genre. It's also making fun of horror fans. And I do not like bullies making fun of me. Why in the earth would anybody sit down and watch a movie where you, for 2 hours or 90 minutes or whatever, where an asshole bully is just punching you in the face for the whole time? Why would anybody do that? I hate it. It really offends me that those movies exist and that people like them. So next, first topic of the day is horror toys. And horror toys come in a couple of different flavors. And this is why I wanted to talk about them. Horror collectibles. Well, actually, we're not talking collectibles. That's a whole separate market. We're just talking toys. Action figures specifically. But, you know, dolls too. Plushies, etc. So, we'll do plushies first. Dolls and plushies. Horror movies are not for kids. Sure, kids can and do enjoy horror movies, so long as they're prepared to be traumatized and they know what they're getting into. If you as a parent let your kids watch horror, or if your kids watch horror because you like it and they watch it behind your back, well, for one, there's nothing you can do about it, because I did. My parents didn't know I watched all those horror movies. So, yeah, but they're not meant for kids. They're not targeted for kids. They're not marketed towards kids. You know, teenagers, some, like slasher movies and things like that. PG-13 horror movies, sure. You know. But, by and large, horror is an adult film industry. Not adult as in, you know, like triple X. But it's not, you know, it's not entertainment made for minors. So when you have a plushie or a doll, and when I say doll, I'm talking soft doll, soft fabric, or like a Barbie doll, of a horror character, you have something that really shouldn't exist. Because kids shouldn't be hugging Freddy Krueger plushies. They just shouldn't, especially because he's a fucking pedophile, for God's sake. And child murderer. That will traumatize your fucking kids. And I'm not going to go out on a limb and go so far as to say adults shouldn't own plushies. I do. I've got Care Bears and I have actual plushies, you know, so, you know, I'm not going to say adults shouldn't or can't own plushies. But, like, plushies to me are supposed to, like, they're like teddy bears. They're supposed to be comforting. Now, while I can find comfort in watching a Friday the 13th movie, because those are my comfort movies, my feel-good movies, I'm deranged, obviously. I'm a chaos witch, you know? I worship chaos. So, yeah, that does comfort me, because, you know, death is a natural part of life. But I'm not going to sleep with a Chucky doll. Oh, God, no. I ain't going to sleep with a Chucky doll. I'm scared to death it's going to stab me in my sleep. I've already talked about on my other channels how terrified I am of, and I think on this channel too, I'm terrified of dolls. Especially ceramic dolls and, what are they called? Cabbage Patch dolls and ventriloquist dummies and things like that. Oh, God. Oh, God. Oh, God. I don't do those things. Those are straight from the bowels of hell, unleashed on the world by Satan himself. So, I'm of the opinion that horror plushies really don't have a place in the world. They just don't, because they're not for kids, and really, the purpose of a plushie is to be cute and cuddly and comforting. And I don't see how a plushie of Pinhead can be cute or cuddly or comforting. You know? But for some reason beyond my comprehension, horror plushies do exist. Now let's talk about horror toys. We'll talk about action figures. Now, horror action figures come in essentially two flavors. You have toy lines made for kids based on horror movies. Now, traditionally, the way they get around this is they make a Saturday morning cartoon based on the horror movie. That's a dumbed down, kidified version of the story, and then they make action figures based on that. Or it happens to be a kid-friendly horror movie like Ghostbusters or Gremlins or something along those, Beetlejuice, something along those lines, where it's like already kid-friendly. It's built into the nature of the film. So I think those are acceptable. Now, do I think a 6-year-old should be playing with a Freddy Krueger action figure or a Pinhead or other Cenobite action figure? Not unless you want to sit down and explain to your 6-year-old what child molestation is. And I don't think you're ready to do that. I just don't think that's a conversation for a 6-year-old. You know? Or BDSM. Are you really going to introduce your 6-year-old to BDSM? Because that's what the Cenobites are. That's a hard concept for an adult to wrap their head around, let alone a child. So I think it is absolutely inappropriate to give a 6-year-old a Pinhead doll or action figure or plushie. There's no justifiable reason for doing that. Unless A, you yourself are a pedophile and you're grooming the kid, in which case go to hell. Or B, you don't give a shit about your kid and you find it amusing traumatizing them, which again, go to hell. Or C, you're really so naive as you're going to sit down and explain to a 6-year-old what the fuck BDSM is? Are you going to dig out the whips, the handcuffs, and the dildos for that conversation? Are you going to demonstrate for your kid? I hope the fucking God not. You see where I'm going with this? There's a line. You know, well, not like a xenomorph from Aliens. It's a dinosaur. You could just tell your kids it's a dinosaur from another planet. That's basically what it is. That's what it is. It's the same thing as a dinosaur from, I don't know, whatever planet they come from. We'll say Mars, to make it simple. Tell your kids, this is what dinosaurs look like on Mars, and give them a xenomorph. You know, it's a bit of a stretch, but it's harmless. Jason is a dude in a hockey mask. So, yeah, he's a dude that kills people. But he's also a boogeyman who punishes bad kids. So, if you're going to read your kids, you know, Grimm's fairy tales, the actual Grimm's fairy tales, not the watered-down Disney-fied versions, there's a life lesson there. You know, eat your vegetables, listen to your parents, don't talk to strangers, don't wander around in the woods. You know, things like that. Yeah, tell them, teach your kids, if you go to the lake by yourself, unsupervised, the boogeyman's going to chop your head off. That's an okay lesson to teach your kid. Scare them away from doing things that are going to hurt them. Don't use it as a lesson to say, you know, teach them, don't have sex until you're ready, because when you're ready is their fucking business, not yours. It's none of your business when they're ready to have sex. You don't get a say in it. Unless, of course, again, you're a pedophile and you're forcing it on them, in which case, eat shit and die. Obviously, they shouldn't be having sex at 8. You know, I'm not gonna put a number on when it's okay to have sex. That's none of my business. I'm not a parent, and it's not my place to say. That's for your kid to decide for themselves. Not for you, not the preacher, not society, not Republicans. It's nobody's business but that kid's. You can teach them right from wrong and teach them the dangers of sex when they're ready for it, whenever you and your kid decide that you're ready for that conversation. And if you want to use a Jason action figure, give it to, like, say, a 12-year-old and teach them that, Yeah, if you have sex when you're not ready for it, the boogeyman is going to stab you in the back and gut you like a fish. Maybe that's okay, I guess. So you have to know the line. I think there are certain horror action figures that can be, within certain contexts, acceptable for children. You know, It the Clown. He eats kids, so that's another one. Hey, don't go in the sewers and don't follow strangers into the woods. That's a good lesson to teach an 8-year-old. So you can use it as a tool. Now, you could, again, let's use Pennywise as an example. You could just give your kid this clown toy. And you don't have to tell them it's from a horror movie or it's a scary clown. Maybe your kid likes clowns. Maybe they just think clowns are cool. I don't know. I think if your kid thinks clowns are cool, you need to get him into a psychiatrist because clowns are the devil and you need to get them help. But that's just me. But the second flavor of horror toys are easier to justify. These are adult collectibles. These are toys made by Todd McFarlane and NECA and Super 7 and other companies that are targeting them towards adults, marketing them for adults, and making them more accessible to adults, less accessible to kids. These toys cannot, by and large, be found in the toy aisle with your regular action figures. They have a separate space for these toys, usually in the electronics department where adults shop, because kids usually don't shop in the electronics department. The video game aisle, sure, but in my experience, these adult collectibles are not kept with the video games. They're kept with the vinyl records, which are another adult collectible. Yeah, try explaining to a 6-year-old what a vinyl record is. Good luck with that. I was 6 when records were a thing, and I still couldn't wrap my head around why anyone would listen to records when we had tapes and CDs. I don't know, whatever. Kids got Spotify, so try to explain to them what physical media even is. Good luck. So is it okay for kids to play with action figures based on horror movies? I think it can be in certain contexts, certain action figures, certain characters. I personally do not think it's ever okay to give a kid under the age of 13 a Freddy Krueger doll. Because Freddy Krueger is a child molester, child murderer. So you're asking for trauma. You're asking for trouble. Jason is a little easier to justify. Or even Michael Myers, because it's just a guy in a mask. He's the boogeyman. You can teach your kids at as young of an age as you want about the boogeyman. That's a life lesson they need to learn. Stranger danger. They need to learn that lesson as soon as they're able to learn that lesson. Because we live in a shitty world where evil people do bad things to kids. If I had kids, just going on a tangent, I don't because I'm trans and I'm not physically capable of having kids, and my romantic partner doesn't want kids for reasons that's none of your business. But if I did, hypothetically, have kids, I would let them decide I would ask them, I would tell them, I have this movie I really like. It's called A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a scary movie. Do you want to watch it? And if they say yes, I'm going to turn the lights on, give them a popcorn, give them a bottle of Coke or something, and I'm going to, sit next to them so they feel safe. I'm not going to put them in the dark with nothing, just by themselves and let them figure it out themselves. And I'm definitely not going to give them a Freddy Krueger action figure until I feel like they're thoroughly ready. And when I say ready, I mean ready, mature enough for that conversation. Because if a kid asks you, Mommy, Daddy, what did Freddy do that was so bad? Well, are you ready for that conversation? If you're going to sit down and watch Hellraiser with your kid, which, why would you? That's a graphic sexual movie. But if you were to do that, it's none of my business. It's your life, your kids, your choice. Are you going to explain to them the difference between sexual pain and sexual pleasure? They probably don't need to be learning about sex to begin with. So, I think it just depends. So I think stuff like Aliens and Predator, they did it right. They made a Saturday morning cartoon and they kidified it so that it was palatable to kids. There has never been, thank God. And I'm a huge, Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite movie of all time. I'm a huge Freddy Krueger fan. But thank God there has never been a Saturday morning cartoon of a Nightmare on Elm Street. That would be wildly inappropriate. But adult collectibles, let's go back to adult collectibles. Adult collectibles are weird because they come in a wide variety. So you have like the monster toys, the movie monster toys that Todd McFarlane does, which are decently sculpted but really crappily articulated. So they're like halfway between a good action figure and a good statue. And then you got the NECA stuff. NECA does real good. I would say NECA is the cream of the crop, the creme de la creme. They're the top of the line. If you're collecting horror toys, you're starting with NECA, or you're aspiring to get NECA, because NECA is where it's at. I have a lot, more than I can count, horror toys from NECA. When I go shopping, when I go to Target, I go straight to the NECA section and look for another horror character to get. And I don't mind that they're 40, 50, 60 bucks because they're worth it. But I'm an adult. I can make that decision, you know? I'm not a kid. Now, I got my first Freddy Krueger action figure when I was 19 years old. 19 is, legally an adult. So, that was my decision. My parents didn't have any say in it because I was an adult at the time. And I didn't tell them anyways because I was still living in their house. And then you got Super 7. Now, Super 7 comes in a couple of different flavors. And we'll talk about the other NECA line in a second. Super 7 comes in reaction figures, and then they come in like premium figures, which I don't know what that line is called because, to be honest, I don't own any premium Super 7s. And I'm just using NECA and Super 7 as examples because those are the ones I know about. Obviously, there are others, but I have no experience with the others. And frankly, I have no interest in them. I'm good with what NECA's doing. NECA is, feeding my hunger. So, I don't need to gorge myself. I'm getting satisfied with what NECA's producing. There's no reason for me to explore beyond NECA. As far as I'm concerned, they're the only ones doing it right. But let's go back to Super 7 for a second. They do have a line that is comparable to NECA's, but they also have the reaction figures. Reaction figures are funky-dory to me because they look like kids' toys. They're designed and packaged and marketed to look like kids' toys. Now, they're not sold in the toy aisle where kids wander, but they do look like kids' toys. They look like your generic action figure that you would buy off of the toy shelf. But they say plain as day on the packaging, adult collectible, not a toy. Even though I open them up and play with them anyways because I'm going to play with my toys. Because to me, it's still a fucking toy. However, I have a low opinion of the reaction figures to begin with because they suck. They're rubbery, which I'm not a fan of. And they're piss poor articulation and really shitty sculpts. They're just basic. They're fucking Kenner dolls. They're Star Wars Kenner dolls dressed up like superheroes and other characters, monsters and things like that. I am not a fan of reaction figures at all. But I've already talked about that at length. I think I did a whole video on why I don't like Super 7. reaction figures. Now, NECA does have another line that straddles the line, and it's called Toonie Terrors. While I think technically Toonie Terrors is marketed towards adult collectibles, they're designed to be kid friendly. So, going back to my what's appropriate for kids, I would not buy a kid a Freddy Krueger NECA action figure or Todd McFarlane action figure. But I think it might be acceptable to get them a Toonie Terror and then just tell them he's a bad guy. You don't have to get into his backstory. You know, I mean, you don't have to even show them the movie. And if they say, what does he do? Just tell them he kills people in their dreams, he gives you nightmares, and if you die in the dream, you die for real. You don't have to get into the backstory if you don't want to. Just know you're going to pique your kid's curiosity, and eventually they're going to want to know. So there's going to come a time where either they ask you or they ask their friends at school. And, you know, good parenting, it's better that the information comes from you than other kids at school. Again, you have to be, as a parent, ready to have that conversation in a responsible manner, and it's not my place to tell you what that looks like. So I am perfectly okay with NECA figures existing for adults because they're targeted for adults and they're not easily accessible to children. So that's a-okay as far as I'm concerned. Now the Toonie Terrors are a little different because it's like they're not targeting kids, but they sure as hell appeal to kids. And so, I don't know. I do own a score of Toonie Terrors myself. I think they're neat. They're not great articulation. They're more or less statues with a limited amount of posability. And they're not great sculpts either. They're cartoonish. You know, they're exaggerated. And they don't typically come with a ton of accessories. They come with, like, their iconic weapon, usually. But that's about it. So, I think this is a complicated subject, and I thought it was a conversation worth having because, you know, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of, you know, variables that are beyond your control. So that's all I'm going to say about horror toys. Moving on, the TV show I want to talk about this week, and I'm not going to talk about a TV show every week because, one, there's just not that many horror TV shows that I've seen, and two, there's not that many out there to begin with. We're getting more of them, but there's just not enough for me to make that a sustainable segment on this podcast. But I want to talk about the ones I want to talk about because I'd rather talk about them here than try to figure out how to do a rent or buy of a TV show, because that's just too, I don't know, it's just too complicated for me. So today I'm talking about Stranger Things from Netflix. Now, Stranger Things is an interesting horror TV show because this is one that is targeted to children. But it's also borderline inappropriate for kids. And it's starring kids. So you're putting kids in dangerous situations. But you're also watching kids overcome dangerous situations. So there's a life lesson in there possibly. You know. Stranger Things currently has 4 seasons on Netflix, and I've seen all 4 seasons twice. I've seen season 1 4 times. I've seen season 2 3 times. I've seen season 3 and 4 twice. And I'm going to watch them all again. I'm going to binge them again right before season 5 comes out because I want them fresh on my mind and they're worth rewatching. So Stranger Things is one I discovered when season 2 came out. I was on a Dungeons and Dragons discussion forum online talking with D&D nerds about, whatever we were talking about at the time. And somebody mentioned the new Stranger Things just dropped. And I was passively like, what's Stranger Things? Because I didn't know if this was an expansion for a D&D or was this a new campaign? What was this? So I asked the question, what is Stranger Things? And in response, I got a YouTube video showing the link to the trailer for season 2. And I watched the trailer and I was like instantly intrigued. I was like, oh, this looks good. So I logged into Netflix because I had Netflix at the time. And I looked up Stranger Things and there it was. And I decided, you know what? I'll see what this is. I'll see what it's about. So I watched the first season. And when I say I watched the first season, I mean I sat down and watched it in one shot, one sitting. I was up until 6 a.m. in the morning. I started it in the evening and I watched it all the way through. I was hooked. And then, obviously, this was when season 2 came out, so I binged season 2. Now, I was instantly so hooked on it and so impressed by it that I had to show it to my mom. I was like, you're going to like this show. So I got my mom into Stranger Things. So I watched season 1 for the second time with my mom, and then we watched season 2 together. It had a blast. And it was really good. Stranger Things is interesting because a lot of horror TV shows get the horror iconography and imagery down, sure, but they fail, a lot of them. Even Buffy, I talked about in the last episode, fail at the scary part. Stranger Things is legitimately terrifying. Not just for a kid, but as a grown adult, I was like scared for those kids. Stranger Things also has real stakes. Characters die. There's no guarantee anyone's going to make it out alive in Stranger Things. And fan favorites can die in Stranger Things. So, like I said, Stranger Things has balls. Now, Stranger Things is not pure horror, per se. It's a mixture of coming-of-age kid show, a group of kids, bonding and, living lives as kids, but also becoming adults. It's also kind of loosely an action-adventure D&D quest type show, because these kids go on a D&D quest to save the world every season, which is pretty fucking cool, that you have these preteens / teenagers saving the world. I think that's pretty fucking awesome. And the monster designs in Stranger Things are fucking awesome. They're really cool. And original. You're not getting zombies and werewolves and vampires and generic shit you've seen a bajillion times before. You're getting monsters that you've never seen before. That are truly unique. And I'm gonna come around to this in a little bit, because I am talking about something related to Stranger Things in a roundabout way later on in the show. But Stranger Things is also, I'm going to use a term I don't like to use, but I'm going to use it anyways, Lovecraftian. This is cosmic horror. This is very Lovecraftian. And there's a whole host of issues with that I'm not going to get into at this point in time. So, I'm not going to break down the individual seasons because I haven't seen them in a while, so they're not fresh in my mind. So I'm probably going to be fuzzy on the details, what happens in which season. So forgive me. I'm not a super fan. I don't watch Stranger Things all the time, I'm enamored by the show, and I'm a big fan of the show, but I'm not like a super fan. So, But Stranger Things is told in a serial format, and each season has a build up to a big bad that you have to defeat. So it's similar in that respects to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But the big bad gets bigger and badder with each season. The first season, the big bad is just a hellhound. Basically, it's a watchdog of the big bad. Season 2, the big bad is more or less the right hand of the big bad, the big bad. And season 3 is a continuation of season 2 while introducing new elements and new characters, which I love the new characters, by the way. That lesbian chick from the, and I forgot her name, but from the ice cream shop. Oh, my favorite character out of all of them. She's my jam. I want to see more of her. I could do with 11 taking a back seat going forward. I've had my fill of 11. I've seen it, good for her, but also like, come on. It's time to grow up, girl. And then season 4, the big bad is actually the big bad. The orchestrator of it all, the architect of it all. So season 5 is presumably going to be a continuation of that. We'll see, though. Because the writer's strike and the actor's strike kind of threw a monkey wrench in what they were doing with Stranger Things. So we'll see if they can get back on track or not. It's going to be difficult. Not impossible, but it's going to be difficult. Season 2 of Stranger Things takes a different approach to season 1. Season 1 is kind of sort of like an X-Files. It's kind of like a murder mystery mixed up with discovering that, oh shit, cosmic monsters are real. And now we have to deal with them. Season 2 continues that while introducing more of the lore, but also digs into a little bit of the X-Men / New Mutants kind of territory, with 11 learning how to use her superpowers while also discovering there are other, I'm using air quotes here, mutants with superpowers. Not necessarily saying she's a mutant, but using that language as a reference to familiarity with X-Men. Season 3 introduces a side villain, the Russians. So now you got to deal with the Russians because this series takes place during the Cold War. So, the big bad in the real world was the Russians. They were the Cobra of our time. So you have that as well. And then you have 11 losing her powers and not being able to help or save the day, and the kids having to figure out what to do without her. And then season 4 is 11 going on a personal quest to unlock her past while also rediscovering how to use her powers and coming to terms with her daddy, her papa, who was a piece of shit. Season 4 was also the one that was, I would say, the most horror. It was very reminiscent of A Nightmare on Elm Street. So, thumbs up right here. And they did do a very good job touching on the satanic panic of the time, which I lived through, and I can tell you, I heard more than one sermon from more than one preacher telling me I was going to hell because I played Dungeons and Dragons. So, this middle finger is for all you preachers who said that shit. You're the ones going to hell if you read your Bible. They don't read the fucking Bible. I don't think I've ever met a Christian in my life that's ever read the goddamn Bible. They just cherry pick verses, but that's a whole nother topic for another day. This is why I'm pagan, by the way. And so season 4 also introduced, or also took the stakes up to the next level and let the big bad out into the world and devastated that little town. I think it's Hawkins, Indiana, if I'm not mistaken. So they really upped the game with season 4. Which is why it's going to be interesting to see what they do with season 5. My personal opinion, less interesting to see what they do with the spin-offs. I'm bored. I don't need a spin-off. Just give me the main shit. I don't need a prequel or backstory or side characters or none of that shit. I'm not interested. But that's just me. Stranger Things is, I'm of the opinion, Stranger Things is a good introductory horror to kids. Depending on their level of maturity and understanding of life and death and make the difference between real life and make-believe. If you got a kid that still believes in Santa Claus, you probably don't want to introduce them to horror just yet. So, use caution, But yeah, I think Stranger Things is pretty good. Now, I want to keep these episodes right around an hour, thereabouts, and I got 20 minutes left. So this next topic I'm going to kind of touch on, but I'm not going to get too deep into it because I've already talked about it elsewhere. I've written about it on my blog, and I just want to put it out there, but let you decide. And we're talking about H.P. Lovecraft and problematic horror creators. So you know how back in a few minutes ago I talked about Stranger Things being Lovecraftian? Well, the reason why I'm not a fan of that term, I prefer cosmic horror as a generic, broader term to Lovecraftian, because Lovecraft himself was a fucking Nazi. And I mean a literal fucking Nazi. He thought Adolf Hitler was a good dude doing the Lord's work. So he is the definition of a problematic horror creator. He's the template, the guy we point to when we want to make a case that problematic horror creators exist. However, as a horror fan, it is undeniable the impact his works have had on horror. So it's hard in this case to separate the art from the artist, because his art, while incredibly influential, is informed by his bigotry. And if you look underneath the surface, it's right smack dab in your face. So this is a problem. So how do we deal with this? How do we handle H.P. Lovecraft today? Especially with the rise, the second coming of Nazism and fascism in America. How do we deal with this? Well, I think the easy answer is to just sweep him under the rug and put him in the past where he belongs and move on and find new horror creators to tell stories in a more enlightened manner. That's the easy answer. But I play Call of Cthulhu. I watch Lovecraft County. Lovecraft Country? I always get those two words mixed up. I've seen some movies based on his works. And I've seen some cosmic horror. And I just talked about Stranger Things. So yeah, I would say I'm a fan of that type of horror. Maybe not my favorite type of horror, but I like it enough that I'm going to watch what would be, air quotes, Lovecraftian horror. However, I think we can get away from referencing him as much as possible, and again, using the term cosmic horror instead of Lovecraftian, which is my preferred term. Even though cosmic horror is hard to define in a sense, Lovecraftian as a word is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything unless you know who he is or are familiar with his works. So again, that's a term that you still have to explain anyways. So I think cosmic horror just makes more sense as a modern term to explain that type of horror versus using an outdated term referencing a fucking Nazi. Now, I just reviewed Jeepers Creepers on this channel. And I talked about the problematic issues I have with the filmmaker who created Jeepers Creepers. The short version is he's a fucking pedophile. And that's a bad dude. So, this is where we get complicated. Is it okay to enjoy something like Jeepers Creepers? Or I'll go a step further in a minute. Recognizing that the creator who created it is a bad person, and when you're consuming this media, you're contributing to him. He's getting money from you, unless of course you're going, the shady routes, which we're not going to talk about here. So how do you enjoy a movie knowing that the people who created it either hurt other people or were hurt by other people? This is tricky. How do you do that? Now, I said I was going to come back to it, so let's get into it. The other one. The other horror franchise that is problematic in its own way. Scream. Now you're just raising an eyebrow. What's problematic about Scream? Wes Craven was a cool dude, allegedly, for all we know. Well, it isn't so much Wes Craven and company that's the problem. The problem is Harvey Weinstein, who put up the funding and produced those movies. So, you have a guy who is a terrible dude, who I'm not going to talk about his crimes and what he did, but I'm going to say Scream 3 blatantly references his crimes and kind of glorifies them in a little bit. Makes them a plot point. So you could argue the filmmakers of Scream 3 were either shining a light on what was going on, or they were winking and nudging, oh, look what Harvey did. Ha, 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 uncomfortable laugh. Either way, it's problematic. But do you just sweep Scream under the rug? I mean, you want to talk about influential. Say what you will about Lovecraft. I would say his influence has sort of, by this point, faded. Other people have taken up the mantle. And I don't think he deserves the credit for influencing people who influenced other people. Because then you got to go back and find out who influenced him and who influenced him and go all the way back to cave paintings. And that's just bullshit. We don't need to do that. We don't have to turn it into an archaeological discovery. So if someone says they were inspired by David Cronenberg, even if David Cronenberg himself was inspired by Lovecraft, doesn't mean the person inspired by David Cronenberg was inspired by Lovecraft. It's not transitive. Okay, it's not math here. It's not A equals B equals C. Because like I said, if you go that route, you just got to trace it all the way back to cave paintings, eventually. So there's no need to go that route. But Scream did have a lasting impact, not only on modern horror, but filmmakers today. contemporary filmmakers reference Scream as an influence, either on their interest in horror to begin with, or, informing the works that they produced. So Scream is a little bit more appropriate to talk about because its impact is a little bit more pronounced and easier to pinpoint. Again, Scream itself being a reference to other works. So you would then say, well, I don't know, Eli Roth was inspired by Scream, but since Scream was inspired by Prom Night, technically Eli Roth was inspired by Prom Night. But then you got to say, well, Prom Night was inspired by Halloween, which was inspired by Alfred Hitchcock, which, you know what I'm saying? Like, how far back do you have to fucking go? If you watched Scream and Scream influenced you, you don't have to give credit to what influenced Scream. You only have to give credit to Scream. You don't have to go any further back than that. However, unlike the asshole douchebag who did Jeepers Creepers, Lovecraft is dead, so you can't really give him money anymore because he's dead. He's already rotten in hell where he belongs. And Harvey Weinstein, although is still alive, he's in prison. So, presumably, he's out of the picture. So, do you wash your hands that way by saying, oh, well, he's no longer a threat, so it's no longer important? Or do you have to have these conversations? Where it's like, hey, you know what? This is problematic. Maybe we should revisit it. Now, when you're talking about something from the 1930s, 1940s, you do have to have a certain level of, that was the time, and so we don't acknowledge that as the way we think today. But at the time, maybe that was an socially acceptable train of thought. So we can look at it through the historical context, the lens of we learn from the past. In which case, you absolutely can study Lovecraft's work. Harvey Weinstein is not from the past. He's the present, the today. It just fucking happened. And it was happening throughout our whole lives. So there are a lot of people's lives who were affected by Harvey Weinstein and his friends and his crimes and their cover-ups. People that are still alive today that were hurt by Harvey Weinstein. So this one's a little harder to justify. So how do you disconnect Harvey Weinstein from Scream? Well, if you know anything about Hollywood, the easy answer, if you're looking for an easy answer, is, well, he was technically just the producer. So he was hands off. He just gave them the money and greenlit the movie and let them do what they wanted to do. I would almost buy this train of thought if it weren't for the fact that Scream 3 was yelling on top of its lungs, look what he did! So you have a Scream movie produced by and greenlit by, with the Harvey Weinstein stamp of approval, literally shining a light on Harvey Weinstein's crimes. And using it as a plot point. I think that's a little harder pill to swallow. So, I don't have an answer. I don't know what the answer is. I don't even know if there is an answer. I just wanted to have the discussion and get you thinking about it. So, where am I personally going to fall? I own Jeepers Creepers on DVD. I own Reanimator on DVD. And I own Scream, the entire series, the whole franchise on DVD. So I've already given my money to these creeps. I can't undo that. I did so without prior knowledge of them being creeps, with the exception of Scream 5 and 6, which Harvey Weinstein had nothing to do with, so those are removed from Weinstein's fingerprints. So, how do I justify that? Well, for starters, I bought Jeepers Creepers on DVD before I knew about the guy was a creep. Does that mean I have to throw away my DVD that I paid money for? Or donate it to the Goodwill? Not necessarily. Does that mean I can't enjoy it for what it was? Well, not without being mindful of what was going on behind the scenes. Now, Reanimator is one that Lovecraft didn't have any direct involvement in because he had already been dead for several decades before it came out. So it was based on his works, but he had no input in it because he was dead. But his name is on it. It's H.P. Lovecraft's Reanimator. So I don't have an easy answer. I don't. Because if you pull the veil back, and you don't have to pull it back very far, you don't have to dig too deep to find out just about everyone in Hollywood is a fucking creep. So, again, it goes back to, are you going to boycott everything and just not consume horror media at all? Or Hollywood content at all? What are you, Amish? Because if you are, I guess, good for you, but why are you watching my YouTube channel if you're Amish? I don't know. I don't have an answer. For me personally, I'm very careful and selective about what content I consume going forward. I try to be mindful of things that are problematic, and I weigh the needs of the people who produced it against my own needs to be entertained. I watch horror because I have mental illness. I have bipolar disorder. I have borderline personality disorder. I have PTSD and other mental illnesses. Horror is how I cope. So for me, it's a coping mechanism. So the benefits I get from watching horror as a coping mechanism for me personally outweighs the people that may have been hurt in its production. And I say that with full knowledge that those people have their own trauma and PTSD. But I worked in the business. I was a television producer. I was a journalist. I was a writer. I'm a published author. I went to school. I went to film school. I studied this stuff. I have friends who are in the business. That's how Hollywood works. It's a shitty business. It's eat or be eaten. There's a lot of successful people on the top who had to eat a lot of people to get there. Are we going to hate them all? I don't know. How do you do that? Now, going back to Lovecraft for a second. Lovecraft's estate has not, to my knowledge, distanced themselves from Lovecraft's pro-Nazi comments. To my knowledge. I'm not saying they have or they haven't. I'm saying that it doesn't matter at this point because he's fucking dead, and he's been dead for a very long time. Are we going to crucify the ancestors of, Alexander the Great for his crimes hundreds of years ago? I don't think so. But the whole sins of the father topic is a discussion for another day. Because that does come up in horror. So I'll get there when I get there. All right, I hope you enjoyed this show. This is a little better production value, higher quality audio recording. You get an actual proper video this time. So, please subscribe to the channel. If you get this through podcasts, through Podbean or not Podbean, excuse me, Spotify or whatever, yay. Please leave a comment, subscribe, share, review the podcast. Let me know what you think. Stay cool.